When I was invited by the university to make a presentation tonight in this important lecture series about place and peoples in the American West, I could not help remembering a story I heard some years ago, back before I left my career as a Washington lawyer and began earning, as my father rather drolly observed subsequently, an honest living. The story has the Pope and a Washington lawyer, the latter resplendent in a flawlessly tailored something by Milan, complete with an Italian silk power tie wrapped around his neck, arriving at the pearly gates at the same time. St. Peter greets each of them warmly and says that he will show each to his respective heavenly abode. The Pope's expectations soar as they approach the Washington lawyer's lodgings, which turn out to be a 47-room manse, complete with a surround of 25 meticulously manicured acres. They then proceed to the Pope's new home, which, to his complete shock and amazement and consternation, is an extremely humble two-bedroom bungalow. The Pope is barely able to hold himself together long enough to sputter, "But what can this possibly be? How can it be?" Replies St. Peter with an alacrity and great sincerity, and in candor probably complete truth. "I'm terribly sorry, but you must understand that when Washington lawyers arrive, we must treat them especially well, because, you see, so few of them ever make it up here." So with this lawyerly full disclosure, you now know the fundamentals of the chap who is addressing you tonight. But in defense of that public relations underclass lawyers, let me assure you that I know of a few museum directors who could be switched into the same category without missing a beat. I have entitled, as has been indicated in my remarks, Museums in Native America in the 21st Century, Journeys in Interpretation. I want to talk with you about Native cultures, past, present, and future, and their intersection through time with museums in interpreting and representing Native cultural history. Perhaps no other American institution, and I even include the Academy in making that statement, has had more impact on how others see and know Native peoples and places than museums. Native communities have had a love-hate relationship through time and over the past century with museums. We love them because they hold so much of the cultural patrimony that has defined us for the millennia. And we sometimes deeply resent them for the very same reason. You should not be surprised by my selection of the specific subject, hopefully, since I took up residence in that sector of professional life almost a quarter century ago and have lived there ever since in blessed happiness. I am now the president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West, having profoundly flunked retirement, and also am the founding director and director emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, as the dean indicated. I would like to take a stab at weaving all of that together this evening because there's a certain logic to it. My point is not what could be a self-indulgent personal history, but instead to reflect on what I consider the journey, not always easy, but I think profound, of museums and Native America over the past several generations. Let me describe briefly, as preface to the path of our cultural and historical journey tonight, the following. Before describing the Autry, I will take a step back initially to the National Museum of the American Indian, where I worked before I had gray hair, or at least as much of it as I have right now. I want to discuss how, in our innocence with intention, we saw the beloved Native place on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. as the museum different, almost an anti-museum, to be honest, in its studied reformation of the relationships between Native America and museums. Second, I want to focus on the Autry itself, and in a manner that is linked to institutions like the NMAI, but in ways important to me, and I think to Native America, still a different kind of institution. But I do see a linkage that not only connects but also makes places like the Autry an institution of the cultural history and experience of the American West, a further step in the journey of museums and Native America. Finally, I want to wrap up the why of it all, if I may. How do both the NMAI and the Autry reflect museums in this century that is different from those in the past, especially as they relate to Native America? In my view, the twists and turns in the relationship between Native America and museums has had an important, indeed seminal and enduring impact on all museums, what they will do and how they will define themselves in the new century. So first, to the National Museum of the American Indian, created by the United States Congress in 1989. The NMAI in cultural origin and intellectual spirit was a potent adjunct of the powerful phenomenon of multiculturalism that occurred in the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In the museum community, this cultural movement frequently assumed the institutional form of ethnic-specific museums, and thus was born the NMAI. By stated mission, board policy, and programmatic design, its intentions were explicit from the beginning. The cultural authority and knowledge authority of Native peoples was to be encouraged, respected, and empowered. Professor Claire Smith, a distinguished Australian archaeologist whose work and scholarship has been primarily with the indigenous communities of that country, confirmed those intentions in a review written shortly after the principal public facility of the NMAI opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 2004. In deciding to create a museum, she wrote, in which Native Americans tell their own stories, unfettered by the interpretive lens of the dominant society, the NMAI has realized its potential to provide unprecedented richness in interpretation and to offer rare insights into the lives of Native peoples. New vistas, directed by indigenous eyes, are open to the public. The empowerment of new voices, however, also can involve a diminution of the authority of established voices. By widening the concept of authority to include the voices of indigenous peoples, many of whom feel they have been silenced too long, the NMAI, either intentionally or inadvertently, challenges the position of non-indigenous peoples as authorities on indigenous cultures. Fundamental paradigm shifts like this one, however, will not be taken lightly, particularly among critics whose museological paradigm emanates from more conventional origins. And we heard from every single one of them. The NMAI's principal public facility in Washington opened in 2004. A critic at one of America's most august publications, the New York Times, expressed deep regret that the NMAI was moving away from the, quote, museum as the temple with its superior self-governing priesthood, close quote, and opined that it should have moved, quote, in the opposite direction, close quote. He opposed the museums making objects available to tribes, quote, for ritual use, close quote, believing that this kind of sensitivity constituted evidence of a, quote, studious avoidance of scholarship, close quote. He expressed open indignation about the specific choices made by the Tohono O'odham community of Arizona in the NMAI's opening permanent exhibition, Our Peoples, when asked to describe the 10 most important events in their history. The late Roger Kennedy, Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, analyzed this review in the following terms, perhaps in stronger words than I might have used, but then he was the Director Emeritus and had the wonderful latitude for expressing his views that I, as a sitting director, rather than founding director and Director Emeritus, probably did not have. The patronizing stench, he wrote, emerging from that passage about the studious avoidance of scholarship grows stronger in another, suggesting that Indians' lack of detailed written languages, sorry about that, all ye Aztec poets, and all ye Mayan historians and merchants, resulted from their having, quote, so little to say. Compassionately, he would have us grant eternal silence to these mute fellow citizens, not only because they were lingo deprived, but because so much trauma, according to him, decimated the tribes. A little well-applied trauma might be helpful to shape that kind of self-assurance. If he had a sense of humor, a critic of this sort might be worth attending, even though tone-deaf to the numinous and colorblind to the symbolic. But what can you do with someone who can write with indignation of Arapaho Odom's responses when they were asked to present 10 crucial moments in their history, and chose as their first, birds teach people to call for rain, and as their last, in the year 2000, a desert walk for health. The Tahano Odom refused to be talked down to. Their little parable says with a smile, we will listen to the elders who have earned our respect, but we will not be patronized by puppies. I'm with them, he concludes. And so am I. At the risk of indelicacy, let me be blunt about the matter. For some reasons, these critics, addressed by Roger Kennedy, have already lost their pitched cultural and intellectual battle, and they know it, however much they continue to protest, pretend, and resist. And museums have become changed in far better places as the direct result through the explicit inclusion of the additional authoritative voices of Native peoples. That outcome brings me to the second part of my remarks tonight, the Autry Museum of the American West. What I would like to say about this latest institutional love of mine comes from answering the following question that flows so naturally from the very success of the NMAI that I've just described. In interpreting and representing the cultural history and experience of the American West, what is the impact for museums of already having multiple authoritative voices at the table of conversation, discussion, and debate? I think that the results are profound, as well as enlarging, enlightening, and enriching for a variety of reasons. The Autry Museum of the American West is an institution that intends to generate learning and create understanding for its audiences of the vast breadth and depth of the American West. The mission statement of the Autry is, quote, to tell all the stories of the American West. That beguilingly simple declarative sentence masks genuine complexity in a museum that seeks to interpret a very culturally diverse part of the United States that more than any other has had a substantial and enduring impact in the politics, economics, and culture of an entire nation. The Autry always has intrigued me because I saw it in potentially transformational ways as the next step, a third wave to follow the NMAI's first two steps as a colonial institution when it was the old High Foundation Museum of the American Indian in New York, and then as an anti-colonial museum of cultural history and experience when it became the NMAI. As an ethnic-specific museum, the NMAI remains a supreme exemplar of a categorical or vertical cultural institution that grew up in the late 20th century as diverse cultural communities, Native, African American, Latino, Latina, Japanese American, and others in the United States, made their way and on their own terms into museums. But an institution like the Autry, I felt, was the next logical step in this progression that began with ethnic-specific museums. And why? The Autry is, by contrast, a horizontal rather than a vertical model of cultural interpretation and representation. In a respect, it assumes, as even a work still in progress, the established presence of diverse and authoritative cultural voices at the table of interpretation that the NMAI and other institutions like it have striven to achieve and have done so successfully. The Autry's purpose, as stated explicitly in its formal mission, is to tell not one, but instead, and as I've already indicated, all the stories of the American West. That aspiration requires that the Autry attempt the complex, often nuanced and subtle task of weaving, indeed interweaving, these stories together by analyzing and interpreting the points of engagement. Sometimes harmonious, and quite often not, but always important, that make up the cultural history of the American West. In other words, an institution of culture and art that was, in an important defining sense, intercultural rather than multicultural. And why was this evolution so important as a matter of using mission and practice at the Autry? I believe it to be so for any of several reasons. First, culture interpreted in this way addresses the subject in the manner it was actually lived. We natives believe correctly that we were the first among those communities constituting the cultural pluralism that is now America. But the fact is that we have all lived together for the better part of 5 centuries, not culturally separate, and instead with full-bore interactivity, good or bad, for the entire period. Second, using this interpretive approach to cultural history allows the exploration and learning to reach what I believe are often the defining interstices, a fancy polysyllable that simply means the in-between areas of cultural history. In those areas of cultural history and associated human engagement sit multiple insights and truths that not only are generally worth knowing, but more specifically, inform museum audiences far more fully and accurately about the past, present, and future, the why and the whence of the culture and arts in this great country of ours. Let me now bring these lofty aspirations and abstractions about methodologies back down to earth through specific examples that sit right now at the Autry. A specific exhibition approximately a year ago, Floral Journey, Native North American Beadwork, serves as prime exemplar of what I am saying. This spectacular art exhibit, drawn primarily from the remarkable collections of the Autry that were once part of the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in Los Angeles, seemed on its beautiful surface a presentation of native beadwork treasures. And it, of course, was exactly that. But the Autry's approach to interpreting the material was far more complex, multifaceted, and expansive. In one sense, the art is ethnically specific and monocultural. It is about a form of art and beadwork design that developed, flourished, and primarily in the 19th century and 20th centuries, ultimately spread across the entirety of what is now the United States. But at its core, Floral Journey was far more complex in its undertaking in museum interpretation. It was a story, both tragic and triumphant, about art and history. It was evidence of intercultural interplay between skilled native artists who used beads that originated in Eastern Europe as their medium to create art in eye-dazzling design forms that originated in both their own history and experience, as well as in the related designs that came to them from Victorian America. It is, in addition to being art, by any creditable aesthetic criteria, also a compelling internal-external, inside-out documentation of native cultural resistance, as expressed in art during perhaps the nadir of native cultural experience. In those objects, and this is a direct contribution on the Autry's part to important new and original scholarship, sat a poignant and elegant story about how native peoples in visually coded language held fast to values, traditions, spiritual practices, cosmology, and history that had defined them for the millennia, and for that matter, still do. Let me offer as a second example of the Autry's horizontal and intercultural approach to interpretation the current ongoing art exhibit, Art of the West. It opened shortly after I arrived at the Autry in 2013 as a major reinstallation of our core art gallery. Its authenticity as a genuinely inclusive and intercultural approach to interpretation is evident in its departures from conventional canons of Western art history. In other words, in what it does and does not do. It does not focus on a singular category of objects or on a particular medium. Chronology has no place in any part of the exhibition, and it mixes present and past throughout. It makes no distinction and uses no conventional Western art history hierarchies as divides among craft, low art, or high art. What it does do is equally affirming of important intercultural departures from Western art history norms in museum representation. Its interpretive scheme is based entirely on themes, religion and ritual, land and landscape, and migration and movement, to be specific. Themes relevant to all communities of art and culture in the American West. It uses objects from across the deep and diverse art and cultural collections of the Autry, some 500 to 600,000 objects strong. The exhibit includes paintings, sculpture, pop art, decorative art, baskets, ceramic pots, glass art, and textiles, and even a legendary Indian chief motorcycle. Let me further illustrate with a specific example from Land and Landscapes thematic area of Art of the West. These assembled objects include a classic panoramic photograph, Dana Point, a painting by a non-native artist entitled Illinois Flatscape, a Navajo artist painting entitled Canyon Lake 3, a Navajo weaver's contemporary weaving of a mesa landscape, and a quilt created by a member of the Hmong community in Los Angeles. These art objects speak directly, from an art historical standpoint, to the ways land and space are organized within a two-dimensional surface, and how they vary. Photographic panorama, the non-native artist's serial view of landscape with its highly articulated and geometrically organized fields, roads, and man-made structures. The Navajo artist's almost complete abstraction of landscape with an intensity of purely organic line and form. And the Hmong artist's narrative quilt that tells the story of a tragic and harrowing escape from war in Southeast Asia to comparative safety in Los Angeles. The second insight is far more and profoundly so cultural, namely how different cultures, in this case, Native, Anglo, and Southeast Asian, use different methods to say something significant about the cultural community's relationship to and experience of the land itself. In short, these art objects, in addition to their dazzling aesthetic qualities, carry substantial cultural comparatives and messaging that tell us much about the abiding complexity and intercultural experience through time of the American West. That statement segues perfectly into the third and final point I wish to raise briefly in my remarks this evening. Namely, the longer range implications of everything I have discussed tonight for the future of all museums in the 21st century. What I'm about to say is really by way of preview, however. Thankfully for you, it is another speech for another day, even though it is a subject about which I have immense passion, and thus want to at least mention to you while I have all of you trapped in front of me. In my journey through the time and space of museums over almost a generation, it comes to this. I know that the popular perception of these great institutions is that they are principally cultural destinations, and very worthy ones, but are somehow ultimately apart from the mainstream, a delightful weekend side excursion, but not a part of everyday life. Over there, rather than right here among us, in the thick of things. I resist that notion and conception of museums, and emphatically in this century especially. I do understand that these great and important institutions of art, culture, and history are as often brilliantly pleasant and inspiring stops on the cultural tour bus route. But I also believe they can be and should be far more than that in the 21st century. I felt so at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I continue to at the Autry Museum of the American West. This country struggles so at the moment, along with the rest of the world apparently, to find and implement civic and social place and space. Those gathering areas for discussion, discourse, debate, even controversy, but always a forum and a safety zone for unsafe ideas concerning cultural history and human experience. The church is less such a space than it was historically, and the United States Congress, as the steward of such discourse, and I say that as an ex-Washingtonian, has become almost tragically laughable to that end. But museums represent at least a notable chink in that apparent contemporary armor of cultural and historical glue. In my view and experience, museums as a counterpoint to that trend, although not able to do everything, can indeed do something, and a very important something. That aspiration was the sheer intellectual and museological elegance of the man who was my first boss at the Smithsonian, former Smithsonian Secretary Robert McCormick Adams, when he said about the NMAI, but about the future of museums in general, We move decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple, with its superior self-governing priesthood, to a form committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of an inclusive dialogue. In conclusion, and hopefully a sweet and gentle antidote for enduring more than 30 minutes of hopefully important but often dense verbiage regarding 21st century museology and museum practice, let me depart on the wings of poetry and a few words in Cheyenne. The former is a poem entitled It Doesn't End, of course, by Simon Ortiz of the Pueblo of Acoma, the state of New Mexico. His focus, apropos of much of what I have said today, was on the continuance of Native culture and identity. His words were these: in all growing from all earths to all skies, in all touching all things, in all soothing the aches of all years, it doesn't end. Simon, of course, was speaking primarily of the continuance of Native identity and culture. But if the cultural journey you and I have taken tonight means anything, surely it is that every one of us, native or non-native, has a stake in all the vital threads of the cultural fabric that make up this great nation. Their enduring value, their contemporary explication, and their continuance into our collective future. On that path together, let me wish us all well with these words in Cheyenne. Namaheo, Najomevet Sun, Najomevet Hatsuta Ohes, Tenkan, Yidahawai Sepeva, Junishe, Nishet. In English, that is Maheo, the great mystery, walks beside you and walks beside your work and touches all of the good that you attempt. Thank you very much.